Our understanding of the history of animals comes from a couple of different main sources of data. One very rich source, of course, are the fossil record, paleontology. So we have some very, very finely preserved fossils for many organisms. The key to understanding the fossil record, you have to remember, is that the fossil record is snapshots. It's just randomly, and sometimes not even randomly, because there's some structures that preserve better and some conditions that lead to more likely fossilization. So it really is not a random sampling, but a biased sampling of the past. But it's still very, very useful. In some ways, I think the fossil record can maybe be, we can make an analogy to, it's like trying to construct somebody's life from what they post on social media. So what somebody puts on Facebook is only maybe a very small, biased view of what their life is. But still, you could learn a lot, but there would be huge gaps in your understanding of that person's life. And so the same thing is true for our understanding of the past history of life on Earth if we're looking at the fossil record. Really, really valuable, but fragmentary and by no means complete. Okay? We also have comparative biology, where we can compare structures in modern living organisms and look for similarities, look for connections, help us to group them into organisms. And when we do this formally, we call it systematics or phylogenetics, which is a portion of systematics. And so modern systematics, modern understanding of relationships among organisms, relies both on their morphology and their genes, right? We're sequencing genes in large numbers, doing alignments, so it's a massive source of data to look at the genes. And both of them together are used to help us understand and figure out relationships. And this is an ongoing process. There are some groups for which we understand relationships really well and maybe are fairly certain, maybe not 100%, but 99.5, 99.9%. And there are other groups where we're still gathering data, doing assessments, and trying to figure out all of the relationships. So just be aware of that it is an ongoing process. So here is our brief, very brief run through of the history of animals. And actually I'm going to start, the very first one is really not animals, but I'm going to mention it because it is the earliest sign of life on Earth. Stromatolites are fossils of colonial prokaryotes. And there's still very similar things around today. Off the coast of Australia, the west coast of Australia, we can find very, very similar organisms to these earliest colonial organisms. Now, it's likely that there were living cells on Earth before. They were so tiny they didn't fossilize and maybe weren't as common. But certainly by 3.5, and in fact, most scientists now push this back to about 3.8 billion years ago, there were living cells on Earth. Okay, so that's, I'm going to have you know it, even though it's not animals, these were prokaryotes way, way, way before animals. But that's the origin of life on Earth. And we are going to fast forward about 3 billion years before we see the very first fossils that look like the earliest animals. So to be able to recognize animals in the fossil record, we need to know what an animal is. So what do animals look like? What do most animals look like today? Well, most animals are very, very complex. And I just have a selection. I just grabbed this off of a website, but a selection of many, many. These are all bilaterians, which are by far the most common type of animal. In fact, the vast, vast majority of all species on Earth fall into this bilateria group. We have fish, we have arthropods, we have chordates and vertebrates, right? So all of these things are animals, but the earliest animals were probably much more simple. These are the more complex ones that dominate today, but the earliest ones would have been more simple. So we might want to look at other groups like Placozoa, we'll talk about that in the next lecture, or Porifera, the sponges, and so we might expect the earliest animals on Earth to be more similar to these simple living representatives today rather than the more diverse and more complex animals that we typically kind of automatically think of when we think of what animals are. So the earliest fossils that we have go back to about 600 million years ago. These are the earliest animal fossils. We have earlier fossils before this, but these are the first ones that can maybe be classified as animals, but even these are a little bit controversial. So these are collectively known as the Doushantua fossils. They show what look like multicellular organisms, again, maybe very, very simple. Some people argue that maybe they were embryos and not the final form, but honestly, we don't know for sure. These are mostly microscopic. They're little tiny things. They have very good preservation, which allows us to see things maybe even down to the cellular level, but there's still some debate as to whether or not they are truly animals. So the 100% we're certain they're animal fossils really go back a little bit less anciently, to about 550 million years ago or so. And these are called the Ediacaran fossils. They're very clearly bilaterally symmetrical animals in some ways. Some of these are interpreted as flatworms or something similar to our modern flatworms, or cnidarians. These look like sea pens, which is a type of a cnidarian. We'll talk about that group in the next lecture also. But just know that these are the first definitive, absolutely 100% sure, yes, they are animals, a little bit less than 550 million, well, right around 550 million years ago, some a little bit older, some a little bit younger. Okay, it's very clearly that they were diploblasts, two distinct layers of tissue. There's some debate as to whether we have true bilateral symmetry yet, but most scientists now agree that there is at least the early forms of bilateral symmetry. And we don't know for sure whether these are very close relatives of modern groups like Cnidaria or the Planaria, the flatworms, right? Or if they maybe looked somewhat similar and are maybe much more distantly related. But they are very clearly the very first earliest animals for sure. Those Duoschanto ones might be, but there's a little bit more of a question mark by them. Okay. Now we're going to fast forward just a little bit to what we call the Cambrian Explosion. Just a little bit more than 500 million years ago, we see this rapid explosion, right? A huge uptick in the types of animals and the complexity of animals that we see in the fossil record. Now, most likely this is due to two things. Number one, we might not have had good preservation before, maybe very low numbers leading to very few fossils. And number two, this might actually, and most scientists agree that at least in part, it represents a true breakthrough, where suddenly we have enough ecosystem complexity to support a wide range of different animals, and so we just see, boom, all of these different animals. Some of them are so bizarre that they're a little difficult to place in modern phyla. So you look at some of these, some of them look like crustaceans, although a little bit weird, but others look like nothing else on Earth today, and that's because they may very well have left behind no descendants. So a rapid, almost like experimentation with very diverse and complex groups of animals. And even though some of them are hard to place, others are very easily placed within modern groups. And so we see the appearance of all of our modern, well, most of our modern phyla, all of the big important ones. So we see mollusks for the first time. We see arthropods for the first time. We see chordates for the first time, echinoderms, all of these big things that we consider, oh, look, these are what animals are made of today. We see appearing within this very short window of time, and that's why it's called the Cambrian Explosion. Now, we can date the fossils. We can do relative dating of fossils and put these back in very clearly just a little bit older than 500 million years ago. But there are other estimates, other ways that we can date lineages also that we'll look at just briefly here as we close up. So here is a summary of fossils of these major groups. And here's our Cambrian Explosion. Notice most of these major groups appear, although there might have been hints and controversial maybe fossils, but still we don't know for sure. The black represent the very first shore body fossils, where others were trace fossils or other maybe distant relatives, but not very clearly what they are. So we see this Cambrian Explosion. The Cnidaria and the Porifera were around before that. We've got some good fossils for them before that. These are represented in these Ediacaran fossils. But really, the major complex animals don't appear until this Cambrian Explosion. Okay, so just know that. I want you to know general dates. I don't need to know them exactly. You'll have these slides or your notes to refer to when you have the exams anyway. And then there's one last note that I want to make about the origin of the animals. An alternative method that we have for dating the origin of groups is something called the molecular clock. And we're not going to get into all the details of this for this class, but basically what it means is we can look at the genomes of organisms, and by making some assumptions, we can estimate when those genomes last shared a common genetic ancestor, right? Now, when we do this with animals, we get dates that are much more ancient than what we see in the fossil record. Some are kind of close. So now we're about 650. That's about 50 to 100 million years before we see the first really good fossils that we can say, yes, these are animals. So why does the molecular clock disagree with our fossil record? And there are two answers for that, and we don't know 100% which one. There could be an error. Molecular clock methods are tricky, especially when we're trying to go back that anciently, and so we might have some error in our molecular clock. It might not be as accurate as we would hope. So that's one reason, but probably a more likely explanation is what we already talked about with the fossil record. The fossil record is fragmentary, and so it's likely that animals were around at this time that the molecular clock is saying, but we just don't have fossils for them, or we have fossils that are a little bit controversial, so we don't have very many of them. They're not preserved in as fine a detail as maybe we would need. And so one of those two things, and most likely the second one, where the fossil record is not complete, and so we would maybe even expect that the fossil record, particularly for groups that don't preserve well or are not very numerous and diverse, we would expect that the fossil record would show a more recent origin than the molecular clock, which maybe is showing the true origin and representing that period of time when we don't have good preservation and a good fossil record.